Every so often I mention that what the pastor says here no one has to agree with, and this is one of those sermons where you're welcome to disagree. All the sermons are, but I want to point that out. Some Christians are taught to think of the Gospels as inerrant factual stories, sort of like affidavits that God personally caused to be written, and then they're notarized just by their presence in the Bible. And I'm not sure what such folks would do about our lesson, where Luke is actually 100% mistaken. There is no region between Samaria and Galilee. I suspect that doubting the existence of a non-existent place might be heresy and a sin to some, geography and history and common sense notwithstanding. And precision on geography may seem like a small matter. Maybe it is. But what about doubting that Jesus literally cured 10 lepers of physical ailments just by uttering words? Literalists, I'm pretty sure that'd be considered heretical and sinful, science and medicine and common sense notwithstanding. And I want to point out rather starkly that I have that particular doubt about today's lesson. I don't accept that the Bible is inerrant or stamped as accurate by God, or that its stories are always factually accurate or even meant to be. In fact, I don't believe that Jesus had supernatural power to cure diseases with simple words or touch. And I say that rather bluntly because I want to make it clear that in progressive Christian churches like this one, you can be a good person, you can be a spirit-filled person, you can be a Christian, and you can even be a pastor and not believe the Bible is inerrant and literal. It's okay. It's okay to rely on reason, to have doubts, and to be religious too. There is no sin in that. Indeed, from a modern standpoint, those who doubt the Bible is inerrant or intended to be literal are on solid ground. If you look in the Bible, you won't find God's notary stamp or a single verse that claims the Bible is inerrant, dictated by God, or filled only with literal facts. Even if a verse claimed all of that about the Gospels, we don't even have the originals of the Gospels, only bits and pieces of hand copies of hand copies of hand copies of hand copies of oral statements of recollections of stories translated from ancient languages and times. All of which in modern jurisprudence would be highly unreliable evidence, a form of hearsay upon hearsay upon hearsay. On a witness stand, Luke and anyone relying on his gospel would be discredited if the gospel's story's factual accuracy was at issue. It's not just courtroom standards that create issues. The gospels are fraught with problems when the application of modern reasoning is used to explore them as inerrant history. Many Americans, most of you, were raised to employ critical reasoning in their thinking. A lot of us don't accept things without proof. And I suspect one reason attendance in churches has dropped off is because of a perception that all churches demand a belief that the Bible is inerrant and literal. Many find that unacceptable and unfortunately think all Christians support the inerrant and literal view of the Bible, and many of us don't hold that view. Here's the thing, the Bible was not written to be used like a history book or a science book. I personally don't believe it was written without errors, nor do I believe it's all literally true. And we don't have to see the Bible as inerrant or as about literal facts. We can choose to, and that's fine, but we don't have to. Such teachings are not biblical, are not from Jesus. They're not from Paul. They're actually relatively new. They arose in response to the age of reason's use of empirical evidence and reason to prove things. And worried about challenges to the faith, fundamentalists started claiming the Bible was written by God, making its word override any other proof. This is a relatively new, modern, man-made doctrine. Not all churches accept that doctrine. Many don't. I'm not saying anything new or radical in a number of mainline churches, because mainline biblical scholars have long asserted and taught their seminarians that the books of the Bible, and in particular the Gospels, were not intended by their authors to be strictly historical accounts of what literally happened. The Gospels were intended to reflect the community's experiences of God. They weren't aimed at historical truth, but rather theological truths. And this means that while the Bible may not set out inerrant factual accounts or events, it nonetheless contains the truth. And some may scratch their heads and ask, can a document with untrue facts speak truth? And the answer is yes, of course. First of all, no one's claiming the Bible is void of historical information. The claim is that the Bible was not meant to be taken as a word-for-word historic account of historic events. Scholars can and do comb through the Bible to find echoes of history. Our short text today is a good example. It's stuffed full of useful historical information we can reason out, like Luke's unfamiliarity with the geography of Palestine indicates he was probably not from Palestine. And his writing style in Greek suggests the author was educated and aware of the make me clean leper story in Mark chapter 1, as well as the Old Testament story about Naaman, the foreign leper that Elisha heals. We can also find in the text the ancient Near East custom restricting lepers to the outskirts of town and requiring them to call out to others for warning. We can see they were required to go to priests for an official okay to get back into the community. We can also see that Jesus was known to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem. And this is very interesting. One of the things I love about the story, we learn Jesus was known and remembered as a healer. But I have to point out, though, that our modern ears generally hear biblical healing stories as asking us to believe Jesus performed supernatural events, miracles, which are otherwise unbelievable. This seems to give us three basic choices with the healing stories. Believe what's unbelievable, disbelieve what is unbelievable, or believe the stories have metaphoric, that is, symbolic truth. And I choose the metaphoric symbolic meaning option. I believe, based on reasons I will explain in a moment, that metaphoric meanings were intended by the Gospel's authors. And one can do a lot with the story just as it stands, as having symbolic truth, but it helps a whole bunch to understand that the term healing has a different meaning in Luke and Jesus' context. Today we tend to hear healing as the sustained and complete cure of a bodily or mental ailment. John Dominic Crossan, a renowned Jesus scholar, one of the most famous and best New Testament scholars, asserts there's another meaning. That we need to understand there are two aspects of sickness, disease and illness. And there's a difference between curing a disease and healing an illness. Disease is caused by an abnormality in a biological function, which is best cured by a medical practitioner. Healing, on the other hand, addresses the experience and meaning of being perceived or seen as disease, as someone who is ill. How others perceive and see a person as ill is best remedied by a spirit person, a holy man, or a holy woman. And applying all this to Jesus' healing leper story, I go like this. Lepers had a skin disease, perhaps something as common as acne or psoriasis, which in Jesus' day made them unclean and outcast from society. Think of this extreme undesirability as their illness. It says uncleanliness is a label derived from social construct. What Jesus did was remove the label. He deconstructs the uncleanliness, and so it no longer exists. It's gone. Jesus altered the perception by declaring the unclean clean and then treating them as such. Well, we can see this earlier in Luke chapter 5, where a leper says to Jesus, if you choose, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and saying, I do choose, be made helps the leper's illness of being healed. Jesus heals the leper's illness of being seen as an untouchable, unclean outcast. And he does this by just touching him, declaring him clean, and making him an acceptable member of his community. And as a consequence, the leper is no longer untouchable, outcast, or unclean. He's healed. He's healed of his outcast status, his illness, though not cured necessarily of the underlying physical disease. Crossan calls parables, quote, a made-up story with a powerful theological punch, end quote. He thinks that the gospel writers, like Luke, were not afraid to create parables of Jesus' life to make their own powerful theological points. And this comports with others who think the writer of Luke expanded the Mark story and Jesus' reputation as a healer to create his own lesson that we heard Brian read so nicely. What could be the theological point of 10 lepers being healed and only one, a hated and despised Samaritan, the lowest of the low in the culture, responding by thanking God and falling before Jesus in gratitude? Another Jesus scholar, Marcus Ford, writes that metaphors are about seeing, not believing. Metaphors, poetry plus, not factuality minus. Metaphor is not less than fact, but more, Ford writes. If we can see today's story as a metaphor, we can see more than just facts, more than Jesus making 10 lepers well and only one saying thanks. We can see Jesus being remembered as a spirit person, a holy man, who on one level transformed lives by, in essence, saying, you are not an outcast in my community. I hereby heal you of the social declaration that you are ill by denying its validity. I don't perceive you as ill, so you are healed. And when we hear the story like this, the good news is that, like Jesus, we are capable of the same type of healing powers. Drug addict. You are not an outcast in our community. Be healed. Bipolar sufferer, you are not an outcast in our community. Be healed. Alcoholic, you are not an outcast in our community. Be healed. Anyone with a disability, you are not an outcast in our community. Be healed. And we know that Jesus did not just limit this healing power to those who were seen as ill. He healed all outcasts he encountered. There's a memory of this in today's scripture. We can hear Jesus communicate, Samaritan, you are not an outcast in my community. Be healed. And we can hear similar memories elsewhere in other Jesus stories. Tax collector, you are not an outcast in my community. Be healed. Prostitute, you are not an outcast in my community. Be healed. Women and children, you are not an outcast in my community. Be healed. And that's good news. And there's more good news. It is that we can do this type of healing too. Non-white people, you are no longer outcast. Be healed. Sick and poor, you are no longer outcast. Be healed. People of other faiths, you are no longer outcast. Be healed. Women, you are no longer outcast. Be healed. Stranger, you are no longer outcast. Be healed. LGBTQ+, you are no longer outcast. Be healed. And see the story in this light. Jesus' supernatural power is transformed to a power we can all wield for good, for God, as holy men and holy women. And that insight alone is amazing. But there's more. Jesus tells the 10 to comply with the purity laws and go to the priests. And the 9 who left did nothing wrong by piously following the law. But they missed out on doing the one thing that can transform not just their outcast status, but their very being. Beyond the rules and regulations is the power of personal response to grace. And grace is absolutely free. It's given with no strings attached. Anyone, even the lowest of the low, even a lawyer, even a non-Christian, even a foreign Samaritan leper, even any of us can be saved from our lesser self by personally responding to God's gift of grace. Not because we have to, we don't, but because turning to God makes us better. As a metaphor, this story proclaims the ultimate good news in absolutely every sense of the word. No matter who you are, no matter what you've done, no matter how low and like you or others may seem, if you just turn toward God, just turn to God, you will be exalted and you will be better.